This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm very happy to welcome back again my friend, Matt Lewis. Welcome back.
Hello, Rebecca. Thank you very much for having me back again.
I'm excited about the topic today because I feel like I don't really talk about Richard III very much on this podcast. I think it's a subject I try to stay away from most of the time because it is so divisive.
Yeah. Much like everyone in my house who is desperate not to talk about Richard III just sometimes.
Yeah, I get that. Well, today I wanted to have you on to kind of go over some myths and misconceptions about Richard III because I feel like there are a lot. And I would be quite a hypocrite who studies Thomas Seymour and tries to portray him in a different light. I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't allow you to do the same thing about Richard III. So I'm not sure where you want to start because I feel like there are so many topics when it comes to him. But I think maybe I would like to know the whole thing about him and Elizabeth of York. Did he really want to marry her?
I don't think so. Some people probably still think that he might have done. And there's two sides to this, really. So I'm going to desperately try and give you the short version of this. It seems like when Richard's wife, Anne Neville, passes away in March 1485, so this is the lady he's been married to for more than a decade. We don't know precisely when they get married, but they've probably been married for 12 or 13 years. The previous year, they've lost their only son that they had together, the only child that they had together as well. So Richard is personally in a pretty dark place. He's lost his only legitimate child, which is a problem as a king, but a disaster for him personally. And he's also then lost his wife, his partner of more than 12 or 13 years. And medieval marriage is really hard to talk about love. But what we can say about Richard and Anne, I think, is that they work together incredibly effectively. And they seem to have got on really, really well. So they're perhaps as close to being in love as we're able to see in any kind of medieval marriage in this way. So Richard is in trouble. And aside from all of that personal grief, he is dealing with the political crisis that goes with a king who now has no queen and no heir. And he seems to almost immediately, and perhaps even as Anne is ailing, when it's clear that she's not going to survive, he seems to begin marriage negotiations with both the Spanish and the Portuguese royal families. And what's interesting about those two families is that they are packed with Lancastrian blood. So John of Gaunt's daughters have married into those families. So here is an effort to reconcile the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster and kind of bring together the two sides, which is what, Henry VII will be famous for doing with Elizabeth of York in the end. Here is Richard perhaps thinking that he could try and do that first. He seems to settle on the idea of marrying Joanna of Portugal, who is a Portuguese princess. I think she's in her early 30s at this point, around about the same age as him. So, not particularly young. She's never been married, not had any children, therefore. So it's perhaps a slightly unusual match for a medieval king who you might expect to go for, a 20-year-old who he might expect to give him children fairly quickly. Because what Richard now needs to firm up his political position is a son, a child to succeed him. So part of these marriage negotiations for him to marry Joanna of Portugal, and we think the earliest surviving portrait that we have of Richard is a copy of what is believed to be the portrait that he sent to Portugal as part of these marriage negotiations. But as part of the same arrangements, there was a match agreed between Elizabeth of York, so Richard's niece, Elizabeth of York, and a Portuguese Duke Manuel of Beja. And Manuel will actually go on to become King Manuel of Portugal a little bit later. So Richard has promised, when Elizabeth Woodville sends her daughters out of sanctuary to his court, he's promised to find them good marriages. Well, here is Richard, over-delivering on that. He says he's going to marry them to gentlemen born, and here he's marrying her to a Portuguese duke who will actually end up becoming King of Portugal. So that's what we know Richard was really doing. But the other side of this is that the story that he planned to marry his niece is a contemporary one. It was buzzing around London throughout 1485, to the extent that Richard is forced to make a public declaration that he did not intend to marry his niece. So that contemporary rumor definitely existed. This isn't a new story that's been invented later by the Tudors or anything like that to try and darken Richard's name. And it causes him real problems. And I think the fact that he feels the need to stand up in London and say that he doesn't plan to marry his own niece is beginning to expose how weak his political position is. That's not something a king would be wanting to do. He seems very much like he's backed into a corner at this point. And it's clearly an effort to twist those marriage negotiations with Portugal that involve a marriage for Richard and a marriage for Elizabeth of York, and turn that into a story that Richard is planning to marry his own niece. So it's that grain of truth at the center of it that is twisted by people working against Richard. And I firmly believe this is probably coming from Margaret Beaufort's faction at this point. She's working really, really hard to promote her son's cause against Richard. She has shown herself to be his enemy by this point. She's an incredibly powerful and resourceful woman. And, I don't dislike Margaret Beaufort. I'm not trying to say that it's a problem that she does this. It's a legit tactic, clearly. But I think she is possibly behind the corruption of that story, that there is to be a marriage for Richard and a marriage for Elizabeth, into the idea that Richard is so unnatural and twisted that he's planning to marry his own niece. So I don't think that he planned to. There is evidence that strongly suggests he didn't plan to, because he was arranging marriages into Portuguese royal family for both of them. But it was a contemporary rumor that caused Richard an awful lot of trouble.
Thanks for clarifying that. And I also didn't know that he was preparing or trying to arrange his own marriage to join the houses of York and Lancaster. I find that really interesting that he was trying to do. We don't hear about that. Why do you think that is?
No, I mean, because it doesn't happen, and because Henry VII will be at great pains to create that Tudor Rose, that story that he has finally reconciled the houses of York and Lancaster. He positions himself as the representative of the House of Lancaster, which kind of isn't really, but it's a great piece of PR. It's a great propaganda story. And it wouldn't serve Henry to say, and Richard III had tried to do it. He didn't quite make it, but I did. It's almost like he needs to have invented this idea of drawing those two factions together finally. Only he could have resolved this problem. And we need to ignore the fact that if he hadn't killed Richard at the Battle of Bosworth, Richard might have actually solved the problem in pretty much the same way.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I think, when we look at Richard III, we always see, when I say we, I mean everybody but you. For those who know of your research, we think of him as turning against Elizabeth Woodville and her children, and essentially then his brother Edward IV. That whole time period after Edward IV died is very fascinating to me, because he wanted Richard to be like the governor of the king's person, or the Lord Protector, right? That was his intent all along, wasn't it?
Yeah, so again, this is a period in 1483 after the death of Edward IV. It is really fraught. It's important to work your way through things in the order that they happen, because quite often, Shakespeare is a prime example of this. He reverses the timeline and twists it all to make Richard look worse. So he has geographically, he has places in a different order on the journey down to London than they actually are, to make Richard look like he's preempting a lot of stuff and that he's actively plotting all of these things. And he has things happen in the wrong order and at the wrong time and things like that. And if you work your way through it, what your view of what happens in 1483 is always going to be completely subjective and completely affected by what you already think of Richard III. I think you can see him I don't think you can see him as wanting the crown from the very outset. I think that's quite an untenable position to take. I think you can see him developing a belief that he needs to take the throne to protect himself. I think you can see him maybe stumbling through the crises and making some choices that end up with him backed into a corner where he has to take the throne. Or you can see him as a much more genuine actor who is faced with a whole series of really quite significant crises that aren't connected in the way that history has joined them all together to create this path for Richard to the throne, that they are separate things. So we know that Edward IV dies unexpectedly in April 1483. He's just short of his 41st birthday. 6'4", great warrior king, undefeated on the battlefields of the Wars of the Roses, dies of a cold. Nobody was expecting this to happen. He leaves behind a 12-year-old son as his heir. And so there is obviously going to need to be a minority government while he's underage. We're told that Edward makes a late addition to his will. So he adds a codicil to his will to appoint Richard as Lord Protector. And the Lord Protector is a very specific and technical position in medieval English history. So Richard's father, Richard, Duke of York, had been appointed Lord Protector twice. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had previously been appointed Lord Protector for Henry VI when he was underage too. And importantly, it doesn't give him any control over the princes at all. He's not protector of the princes. He's not protector of his nephews at this point. The role of Lord Protector is essentially the head of the council, sort of in charge of government, responsible for internal and external security and for making sure that the government runs smoothly. Traditionally, there has been a strong effort to oppose the existence of a Lord Protector in the 15th century because people get concerned about one person having too much power. And by extension, the fact that one person has too much power means that everybody on the council has much less power. So you tend to see a position where the council tries to reassert itself. So Henry V had originally envisaged a regency in England for his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And the council refused to allow that to happen. They create this position of Lord Protector for him instead. So it's a significant role in government, but it doesn't put him in charge single-handedly, and it doesn't give him any role looking after the princes. There is this sort of separation of powers that has existed since the reign of Henry VI, where someone else would have responsibility for the person and the education of the young prince. And that would be, at this point, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, Elizabeth Woodville's sister. So Edward IV's brother-in-law, the prince's kind of maternal uncle, as opposed to Richard, who is their paternal uncle. And so what we see is Richard is not advised. Richard is living in the north of England at this point at Middleham Castle, predominantly ruling there. He's been up there for a decade or so. We're told that, and again, we don't have a lot of the records for this, so we're relying on later chronicle accounts, but they tend to corroborate each other. Richard isn't told by the council that his brother has died. So the Queen tries to take control of the council, and she instructs them not to send word to Richard that his brother is dead. So that already smells a little bit funny if you're Richard. He gets a letter instead from William Lord Hastings, who is Edward IV's kind of best mate. And William Hastings says, Edward's died. The Queen didn't want you to know. I'm telling you, you need to get down here as quick as you can because the Woodvilles are desperately trying to initiate a coup and take over the government. Again, that letter doesn't survive, but we're relying on later accounts that seem to corroborate each other that this is what happened. And we do have accounts, chronicle accounts, that in London, in the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, so while Richard is still in the north before he's even left home, that there are armed men in the streets of London, some for the faction of the Queen and some for the faction of Lord Hastings. And that Lord Hastings is threatening to go over to Calais and barricade himself in there if the Woodvilles are allowed to remain in government. So there is tension almost boiling over into violence in the streets of London before Richard is anywhere near this. So we have two factions causing trouble. One faction has prevented Richard from finding out that his brother is dead and he needs to come to London and he's supposed to be Lord Protector. The other faction is kind of egging him on. So Hastings is saying, get down here and sort this out as quick as you possibly can. So then Richard, we're told, arranges to meet his nephew at Northampton. So Edward V is moving from Ludlow, where he's been raised on the Welsh borders, towards London. Northampton is a sensible place for them to meet on the way for Richard coming south. Northampton is a significant town at this point. It's hosted parliaments. It has plenty of space and all of this kind of thing. Richard gets to Northampton and is greeted not by his nephew, the new king, not by his entourage, but by one person, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, who says there simply wasn't room in Northampton for all of us. So what we've done is we've moved the king about 15 miles closer to London to, traditionally it said that his entourage at least stayed at Stony Stratford. which is about 15 miles closer to London than Northampton. And this is where Shakespeare tends to switch it around. Shakespeare has Stony Stratford being on the way to Northampton so that Richard attacks them on the way to the meeting place. But there is also, just down the road, a couple of miles away from Stony Stratford, is the Woodville Manor of Grafton Regis, their caput, their main seat. I suspect that Edward V is there. And so Richard arrives in Northampton to find that the king that he was supposed to meet there, his nephew, isn't there. He's been moved, almost half a day's travel closer to London. And on the basis that this place couldn't accommodate all of the people, which is absolute nonsense. So for a man who has left the north with Hastings' warning ringing in his ear that the Woodvilles are up to something, this is beginning to smell a little bit worse. And so then when Richard arrests Anthony Woodville, the next morning and rides to Stony Stratford to catch up with the king, I don't think it's as suspicious as people make it out to be. It's only suspicious with the benefit of hindsight if you start to think this is Richard planning to take the throne. What I think is actually happening is he's starting to think, I need to get a bit of control over what's going on here. If the Woodvilles are up to something and Hastings up to something, I need to get the Woodvilles out of the picture. And it's perhaps significant at this point that he arrests Anthony and a couple of others, senior members of his nephew's household, but he doesn't have them executed. He has them sent up north to prison. So this isn't kind of a ruthless seize them and chop their heads off. There is something else going on here. This isn't a permanent solution, possibly. And there is an argument that could be made for him perhaps viewing Anthony Woodville and one of the others that's arrested is Sir Richard Grey, who is Elizabeth Woodville's younger son from her first marriage, just to make this a little bit more complicated. So he's got two members of the Woodville family. And it's possible that he's sending them up north almost to act as hostages for the good behavior of the Woodvilles once he gets to London. If he needs a bit of leverage to make them behave, then it kind of makes sense to do what he's done. So he seizes the person of the king at this point. And this is a significant change because this isn't a position that he has a right to as Lord Protector. This is him taking that from Anthony Woodville, who he's had arrested because he thinks he's up to something dodgy. They travel on to London, and Elizabeth Woodville, when she hears what's happened to her brother at Stony Stratford, flees into sanctuary with her other son, Richard, Duke of York, and all of her daughters. And I mean, no one ever comments on the fact that smells a little bit funny. Yes, she might be a little bit worried about what's going on, but here is a woman who the chronicles and the sources that we have are telling us is trying to initiate a coup in London. It's backfired spectacularly. Her brother's been arrested and she flees into sanctuary. She doesn't greet her son arriving as the king. She doesn't make any effort to write this out. She doesn't try and justify what she might have done. She flees into sanctuary. And for me, there's a whiff of a guilty conscience in there that we don't very often talk about. And then Richard kind of goes through all of these processes. The council criticise him for not getting Elizabeth Woodville out of sanctuary. So he seems to open negotiations to get her out of sanctuary, but she's absolutely not budging. But he is criticised heavily for her failure to come out of sanctuary. And then we get this story emerge that Lord Hastings attends a council meeting, is charged with treason, and is summarily beheaded on the orders of Richard III. And again, if you tie that into some greater plot to take the throne, it begins to look really, really off. But as a moment of crisis on its own, I think, again, you can view it slightly differently. Hastings is the other problem that we talked about in London. He's the other faction that is causing trouble. And we get a couple of sources that tell us that, in particular, they suggest that a lawyer named William Catesby, who becomes closer to Richard's government later on, has gone to Richard with some evidence that Hastings is up to something. And we actually get Tudor chronicles later in the 16th century that tell us that Hastings had been organising meetings at St. Paul's to get the great and the good of London to oppose Richard when he got there. He tells Richard to get custody of the new king and get to London as quickly as he can. And when he hears that Richard has done this, he gathers lots of the worthies of London at St. Paul's and said, oh man, he's taken custody of the king And now he's coming to London. This is terrible, terrible. What are we going to do about it?
Wow.
And what people never allow for in Hastings' situation is this is a man who is wealthy and has high status based on his very close personal connection to Edward IV. He is at risk of losing everything. He doesn't have an earldom. He doesn't have any kind of power base of his own. So he is looking to protect himself. And he's clearly playing games. I think we can say that he's up to something. So when Richard gets news that he has committed treason, it may not come as a massive surprise to him. This is a guy who has already threatened to go over to Calais and barricade himself in and start attacking England with French help. This is a man who is still in receipt of a French pension from the King of France that he's had since the 1475 invasion, which is a pension that Richard had refused to accept. So he's in the pay of the French king. The French are raiding the south coast of England. This is another part of the jigsaw that people don't very often talk about. Oh crikey! I'm getting in the right mess here. I'm going to
I love this.
tie you up
Keep
in
going.
knots with all of this. So just before Edward IV dies at Christmas 1482, Louis XI stops paying his pension to Edward. So when Edward had invaded France in 1475, Louis had bought him off with a huge pension that was to be paid twice a year. And at Christmas 1482, the instalment that is due doesn't arrive, and Louis says that he's not going to pay it anymore. And this was meant to buy permanent peace. And as we move into the new year, we get French shipping begin to attack English shipping in the Channel. And in the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, there are French raids on the south coast of England beginning to take place as well. So we're on the brink of war with France threatening to invade England as well. And that's something else that you've got to throw into the mix that Richard is going to become aware of. There is a whole lot of stuff going on here. And the last thing he needs is someone like Hastings, who is threatening to go over to Calais, to France, and use his connection with the King of France and the money that he receives from a pension from the King of France. All of a sudden, this looks dangerously close to treason. He's colluding with England's enemy to try and protect his own position. Is it unreasonable that in this moment, Richard views that as treason? And as Constable of England, which is an office that Richard holds, he's entitled to summon a court-martial, and the powers of the constable are documented. We can read what those powers are. And Richard is entitled to summon a court-martial and try cases of treason based on evidence that he has seen, and he is entitled to act as judge, jury, and an executioner, and there is no right of appeal. Now, we would say that's massively inequitable, but these are rules that his brother Edward IV had drawn up during the Wars of the Roses, when there were these moments of intense crisis that needed to be dealt with quickly. So for me, that's what Richard does with Hastings. It seems like some kind of evidence might well have been presented to him, and he is convinced enough that he just needs to deal with Hastings as a problem and get him out of the way. If you can cut off one man's head and do away with all of the potential crises that a wider civil war or invasion from France might cause, then possibly you're saving lives. And this is to Richard's mind, the best solution in the moment. So he has Hastings executed. And again, that begins to look a little bit darker when we get a few days further in. Where it's kind of 13th of June, Hastings is executed. A few days later, the younger prince, Richard, comes out of sanctuary with the intention of attending his brother's coronation. And a few days after this, that coronation is postponed. And the story begins to emerge that Edward IV had married Elizabeth Woodville bigamously, that he'd already been legally married when they had wed, which has the effect of making all of the children of that marriage illegitimate, and illegitimate children cannot succeed to the throne of England. And again, the question around this is the bigamy story fabricated by Richard as an excuse to take the throne? Is the bigamy story invented by someone else and sold to Richard? People who don't want a child king and the problems that all of that is going to bring, and think perhaps Richard as a 30-year-old experienced governor and soldier is the better option at that point? Or is it true? Is there genuine evidence? We're told in the source material that the evidence for the pre-contract is displayed, is shown to members of Parliament. Parliament isn't sitting, so it's not shown to Parliament, but people have gathered in London ready for a Parliament that was due to open. We're told that they view all of this evidence and that they accept it as genuine proof of a pre-contract. And that evidence doesn't survive for us to look at it today. Probably, I would contend that because it was destroyed by Henry VII, who goes on to marry one of the children that is made illegitimate by this evidence, Elizabeth of York. So he can't have that. If that evidence is convincing enough that people in 1483 believed it, he can't have that evidence lying around. So quite possibly it's destroyed. If the evidence was obviously fabricated or laughable, I would argue that Henry VII may well have kept it as proof that it was such a stupid story. It was clearly made up. So perhaps the fact that we can't see it tells us something. But what we do know is that people in 1483 who saw that evidence believed it. Maybe they believed it because they wanted to. People will often say they believed it because they were scared of Richard. I don't buy that at all. This is not a man who has an army in London. And London is an incredibly self-confident and assertive city that has no problem shutting its gates to kings. It's done that throughout the Wars of the Roses when it suits it. Yeah. So I don't think Richard is in any kind of position to be threatening people to believe this evidence. But again, if we see it as part of a bigger plan, Richard has made it up to excuse taking the throne. I think we ought to give more consideration to the thought that perhaps the pre-contract was either real, or at least that Richard was led to believe that it was real. So the story is essentially, the bigamy story is that Edward IV has married a lady named Eleanor Butler in secret, and that he then marries Elizabeth Woodville. And part of the reason it's so believable, I think, is that, is it beyond the realms of possibility that Edward IV married a woman in secret? Well, no, it's not, because we know he marries Elizabeth Woodville in secret. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't become public knowledge for several months later when it suits him to make it public knowledge. So the only question is it beyond the realms of possibility that he did that more than once? I don't think it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always feel like we hear he was such a playboy. He, loved the ladies, and he would do whatever it took to get them.
Yeah. I mean, when he's kicked out of England, when he's briefly ejected from his throne in 1470, and then he comes back in 1471, there is one of the sources that says that London was 100% behind Edward IV coming back. And that was partly because all of the merchants in London that he owed money to wanted to get paid. But the other major reason was that all of the women of London wanted back into Edward's bed. So, there his carnal reputation has served him well. But in 1483, that same reputation, which had existed, for more than a decade by this point, that same reputation is causing a problem. And we're so willing to accept that Edward was, this playboy, becomes king at 18, secretly marries to Elizabeth Woodville, and he's up to all kinds of stuff, and that women want back into his bed so much that in 1471 they're encouraging their husbands to support him militarily. And yet we refuse to believe that in 1483 there could be a story come out that he's done something a little bit dodgy in his personal life.
Right. I am a little bit curious too, Matt, on the relationship between the three sons of York. And I know that's kind of going back a little bit, but I think it's important to the story. Like, how well did Richard get along with Edward and his brother George? What kind of relationship did they really have? Do we know?
Again, we're using the bits of evidence that we have to sort of piece the story together. We don't have the diary of Richard III, age 13 and a half, saying which brother was his favorite. Unfortunately, that would be great. I think the important thing is that he has very different relationships with both of them. So his relationship with Edward is much more prominent and famous, I guess. And this is a relationship. So Edward is about 10 years older than Richard. And when Richard's life is being thrown around in the early phases of the Wars of the Roses, he spends a period in exile as a small boy, and comes back, and his father and his other brother Edmund are killed at Wakefield. It's Edward then, when he becomes king, who starts to provide Richard with a little bit of security, which is what he's been missing for all of his life. And we're told that Edward puts his younger siblings up in a palace in London, and that Edward is visiting them every day to make sure that they're looked after. No expenses being spared caring for them. And Edward is literally coming to the palace every day to see them and check up on them. So I think Edward must have become something like a replacement father figure for Richard at this point. He is this glittering figure, 6'4", absolutely giant of a man, this great warrior who has avenged their father and their brother, who has made kings out of the Yorkist family, and who is now taking care of Richard. He makes him a Duke of Gloucester just after his coronation, and provides for his upbringing, and later on makes him Lord of the North. So I think this is where Richard develops a really close connection to Edward that is one, I think, more like father and son, with maybe just a little bit of hero worship in there. This is probably someone that young Richard is thinking, I want to be like him. That's my brother. I could be like that. And we then get this image of Richard as utterly loyal to Edward for the rest of his life. And that's not entirely true. So if we go back to that 1475 invasion of France, Edward allows himself to be bought off by Louis XI of France for, huge mountains of gold. And Richard is not quiet in voicing his disapproval of that. He refuses to take the French pension that all of the other noblemen are taking. He absents himself from the signing of the peace treaty at Picquigny. He goes off to inspect the troops somewhere else. And that would have been a very public snub for Edward. George and all of the other senior nobility of England are at Edward's side when he's meeting the King of France. He would want this to be as prestigious as possible. And Richard refuses to be there. And there was a moment a few years earlier as well, in the late 1460s, when the Stanley family, so, the Stanleys, this is perhaps the origin of the Stanley family's problems with Richard as well. There is a feud going on between the Stanley family of Thomas Lord Stanley and another Northwestern family called the Harringtons. It's a really, really complicated matter, but it ends up in court, and Edward finds in favour of the Stanleys, which essentially means that the Stanleys would get all of the Harringtons' property, including Hornby Castle, which is an absolutely gorgeous building that was their home. And the Harringtons refuse to give it up. And Richard goes and places himself at Hornby Castle at a point when Thomas Stanley is having a cannon drawn up in front of the castle, ready to blast the Harringtons out of the castle. Richard is writing letters saying he's at Hornby at the dates that this is going on. So he's clearly inserting himself in this feud against the Stanleys in favour of the Harringtons, but also against his brother, who was found in favour of the Stanleys. So Richard, I think, is someone who I would probably characterise as offering loyal opposition. He's willing to tell Edward when he thinks he's wrong, but that doesn't mean he's disloyal to Edward. He's ultimately very much on Edward's side. George, I think, so the brother that is a few years older than Richard, I think Richard has a very different relationship with him in that they're raised together in the nursery at Fotheringhay with their sister Margaret, who becomes Duchess of Burgundy. And Edward is already gone and in his own household by this point. So they grow up together. That period of exile that I spoke of as young boys in 1460, Richard shares that with George and nobody else. We're told they're put in a boat with a handful of servants and rowed kind of out into the channel to who knows where. And Richard at this point is 8 years old. I mean, it's a pretty frightening experience, I would imagine, for a small boy. Yeah. And he shares that uncertainty with George. And we're told that, when Warwick is eventually, when he rebels against Edward and is eventually killed, George is already married to Warwick's oldest daughter, Isabel Neville. Richard ends up married to the younger daughter, Anne Neville. And the Warwick inheritance has got to be carved up between them. And we're told then that, there is a whole lot of fracas between the two brothers, and George is going absolutely mad at the idea that Richard is going to get stuff that George wants for himself.
Yeah.
But I think this is just a bit of sibling rivalry. Who hasn't had that kind of argument with their brother over a bunch of toys or whatever else? Well, this is just medieval noblemen's toys. So for me, that's a bit of kind of fraternal, brotherly rivalry that doesn't necessarily mean that they hated each other. Because again, when George ends up falling into, I don't know what, his 5th, 6th, 500th bout of disloyalty to Edward, and Edward finally feels like he has to deal with George, and he has him tried in Parliament and executed, the sources all say that Richard stays away. and won't be part of all of this. And I think this is a moment in which he is so deeply conflicted between the brother who he likes and is closest to in age and probably in experience and everything else in George, and the brother to whom he owes everything that he has, from his security to the lands and titles that he has and his position in the realm, who is also the head of the family and is the king. You know, these two people are now at each other's throats and one of them is going to die. How is Richard supposed to choose between the two of them? And right. I think it's pretty clear that he can't, because he simply absents himself and stays away. And he seems to dislike Clarence's execution. He will, later on as king, he writes a letter to Ireland, which is slightly cryptic. It's a little bit odd, but essentially he seems to blame Elizabeth Woodville for George's execution. And whether this is how he rationalizes one of his brothers killing another one of his brothers, that he thinks there must be some external force that drove Edward to do it, I don't know. But he seems in this letter he sympathizes with the Earl of Kildare, who's had a relative murdered, and sort of alludes to the fact that he believes the Woodvilles were behind Edward deciding to execute George. So I think he has really complex and really interesting relationships with both of his brothers that are very different. And when push comes to shove in 1478, when George is on trial in Parliament, I don't think Richard can reconcile that conflict. I don't think he can pick a side. I mean, ultimately, I guess you have to say he comes out on Edward's side because his silence allows George to be dealt with and ultimately executed. But I feel like, just as a human being, that is an incredibly difficult moment for Richard to be in.
I can't even imagine what was going through his mind at that time. And what do? You know, I come from a family with 4 children, and the eldest, my sister, is 8 years older than me. I have an older brother who's 5 years older than me. And then I have a younger brother who's about 2 years younger than me. And of course, me and the younger sibling are much closer because we were closer in age, and there's that distance between the older ones. So as you're telling this story, I'm trying to imagine if I had been put in that situation, what would I have done? That must have been so impossible for him. I can't.
Yeah, and I think these are the very human sides of the story that are easy to ignore when we just think of Richard as that kind of Shakespearean monster who is, desperate to get the crown and is willing to murder his way to the throne. I think you look at all of these milestones in his life, and it's possible to create a picture of a very different, much more complex man whose motives in 1483 become actually much less clear. And I think there is more room for discussion. I'm not going to say that Richard was a saint who was not up to anything even remotely dodgy in 1483, but I think there is far more going on than people normally allow for.
I always think about their mother, Cecily Neville, during all of this, how impossible it must have been for her to witness this. And I do wonder, how involved was she? Was she behind the scenes talking to Edward, saying, you can't do this. He's your brother. Think about this. There's so much about history that I feel is unwritten too, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we know. So when Edward first becomes king in 1461 after the Battle of Towton, when he goes up north to try and deal with the opposition up there, we know that he essentially leaves his mom, Cecily, in charge in his absence. He doesn't leave some duke or earl or one of his captains behind. He puts Cecily in charge, and you get ambassadors' letters going back to various countries saying, you want to do business in England at the moment, you need to talk to Cecily, the Duchess of York. You need to talk to Cecily Neville, the king's mum, because actually she's the one in charge at the moment. So his mum is clearly someone that Edward relies on and trusts at the beginning of his reign. But I think, like Warwick, and we see this is so striking for me because you see it with Henry VIII too, who is Edward IV's grandson. He initially not very interested in the business of ruling and being king, and allows others to fill that void for him. In Edward's case, it's his mum Cecily, and it's the Earl of Warwick. And in Henry's case, it's probably Wolsey, is doing all of the doing. But there comes a point where they want to be more, they become more self-confident, they want to be more assertive, they want to take more control, and all those people are then necessarily in their way. And I think that's a lot of what's behind the fall of the Earl of Warwick in Edward IV's reign, and behind the fall of Wolsey in Henry's reign, that they have, they've effectively exercised the power of a king for a while, and that makes them a bit of a problem to the man who's now decided, actually, I quite fancy actually being king as a day job. So I think Cecily begins to take more of a back seat as Edward becomes more sure about what he's doing, more certain about what he's doing. But her role in all of this is really, really interesting. So exactly as Richard is having to deal with two brothers at each other's throats, Cecily's having to deal with two of her sons. One of her sons is putting another son on trial for treason, which means death if he's convicted. And there was no way that George wasn't going to be convicted. The king is not putting someone on trial in Parliament, his brother on trial in Parliament for treason and finding him innocent. Right. So Cecily must have known that was going to happen, but she doesn't abandon Edward. And her role in 1483 is also very, very interesting. So unfortunately, we don't have a record of where Cecily is during these crises of 1483. By this point, she's largely moved her household out of London. She's using Berkhamsted quite a lot, just outside of London. I find it impossible to believe that in the aftermath of the death of her oldest son and the succession of her 12-year-old grandson and the problems that are emerging in London, that she hasn't made her way to the city to be involved in what's going on. This is a woman who very much knows what she's doing and is capable of taking control and imposing some order. We know that Richard, when he arrives in London, bases himself at Baynard's Castle, which is the London home of Cecily Neville. So he's using his mom's house in London. So throughout all of these moments, when he's executing Hastings, when he is revealing this story of the pre-contract that makes Edward IV a bigamist and his marriage illegitimate, and all of Cecily's grandchildren by Edward IV illegitimate and incapable of acceding to the throne, Richard is doing this from his mom's house. When he receives the delegation from London that ask him to take the throne and become king because he's the next in line, he's the next viable candidate, that is done at Baynard's Castle, at Cecily's house. So even if she's not there, there is some kind of element of her quiet approval of what is going on. Wow. She's not protesting against it. She's not kicking Richard out of her house for doing all of this. Throughout Richard's reign, she doesn't abandon him. So if you think, for people who believe that everybody in England knew that Richard had murdered his nephews, how do you reconcile Cecily Neville remaining on good terms with the son who she believes has murdered her grandchildren to get to the throne? I mean, maybe she's a pragmatist, but this is taking that to an absolute extreme. When Richard begins to face those crises, personal crises that we talked about earlier with the death of his son and his wife, he's writing letters to his mom and saying, I hope you'll think about me. And Cecily, he goes to visit Cecily not long before Bosworth, kind of last time she'll have seen her last son, just before Bosworth. He goes to visit her. So they remain close. And it's kind of, the human actions of people involved in the stories here are always really interesting to me. Why doesn't Cecily turn against Richard? If he has turned on his older brother, who we're often told is Cecily's favourite son, and disinherited her grandchildren, possibly murdered them, why doesn't she turn against him? Why is she still supporting him? Why is she still offering him comfort when he needs it? Why is she still offering him support? And I always say the same about Elizabeth Woodville. If everybody in England knew that Richard III had murdered the princes in the Tower, where is Elizabeth Woodville's accusation against Richard?
True.
Because she lives until 1492. I mean, I would say, okay, from 1483 to 1485, it's not good politics to accuse the king of murdering children because he'll chop your head off. Fine. Stay quiet then if you want to. Elizabeth Woodville lives until 1492, and most of her daughters live into the 16th century. Yeah. Where is the accusation from any of them that their uncle, or in Elizabeth's case, her brother-in-law, ruthlessly murdered two young children? Where is their desire for justice for that? Where are the chantry chapels for the souls of the princes? Where are the records of the masses being said for their souls if they're dead and in heaven? We have none of that. This absolute silence on the fate of the princes I think is a real issue for people who want to believe that everybody in England thought Richard had murdered them, because we simply don't have the source material to back up the idea that there was a widespread rumor in England that Richard had murdered the princes in the Tower while he was alive.
It's the easy go-to. Oh, Richard did it. He wanted to be king. He offed his nephews. It seems rather drastic.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting story that emerges as well. People will quite often say it's a result of Tudor propaganda, and I think, for me, the story that Richard murdered his nephews is not necessarily created by Henry VII and the early Tudor government. It seems to arrive in England when they arrive, and it was a rumor that existed in France. But again, there's lots of context for France. If you've got another couple of hours, I can explain the context for the rumor in France. But that rumor has sort of arrives in England. And I think, for me, the interesting thing is that the Tudor government under Henry VII need Richard III to be a tyrant. They need him to be some kind of evil monster, because that's the justification for Henry invading England and murdering God's anointed king in battle. He justifies that by saying that Richard is a terrible, terrible tyrant. And Henry never accuses Richard of murdering the princes in the Tower, which is fairly significant, I would say.
Yeah.
But he allows this rumor to propagate and spread out throughout England. And I think that is in part because Richard as a tyrant is actually really, really hard to prove. If you look at what Richard is interested in, both as Duke of Gloucester and as king, there are many ways in which he's the anti-tyrant. You know, this is a man who sponsors the book trade and the spread of information, and he's reforming the law to allow greater access to courts and things for poorer people. You know, he is not a tyrant. Is someone who is there for their own benefit, who is protecting themselves at the expense of everybody else. Richard is almost doing the opposite. He's leeching support from the nobility in an effort to improve the lot of those who have no power to keep him on the throne. So again, we would question why he's doing this unless it's a genuine interest. And it's one that we can demonstrate during his time as Duke of Gloucester in the north too. There is some continuity there. Richard as a tyrant is really, really hard to prove. But if you allow the story that he's a child murderer to leach out, then Richard as some kind of evil monster becomes much easier to believe. And you can layer that on top of these stories that he murdered the princes. It suits the Tudors under Henry VII to have the princes dead, because Henry will face opposition. They argue, well, they have a better claim to the throne and probably a more popular claim to the throne than Henry does. So it suits him for people to believe that they're dead. And if they want to believe that Richard did it, that's absolutely great, because then you can begin to build this tyrant that Henry Tudor needs Richard to be, on top of the foundational story of him being a child murderer, which is impossible to prove, I would say.
Yes. Matt, I always love talking about this era with you, because you are so knowledgeable, and I feel like you just have a way of showing us what the records actually say and what was going on with these people during the time. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show today to dispel some of these myths and misconceptions. Is there any that we missed?
One of my favorites is actually one of Shakespeare's, in which the very first appearance of Richard, Duke of Gloucester in Shakespeare's story, so the future Richard III, comes in one of the Henry VI plays, when Richard takes part in the Battle of St. Albans and ruthlessly murders the Duke of Somerset. And that battle took place in 1455, when Richard was 2.5 years old. So if ever you want an indication that Shakespeare is not writing factual history, he has a 2.5-year-old toddler running around the battlefield killing dukes.
Well, that confirms that he was a tyrant, right?
I mean, a monster from an early age, literal terrible twos in the extreme.
Oh my gosh, that's great. Well, I know I do want to give you the opportunity to kind of pitch some of the stuff that you currently have going on too. And I've been seeing on social media, you're working with somebody on a film.
Yeah, so this is an actor named Thomas Dennis, who was also the actor who did the Voice for Richard project that I was involved in recently. He's someone who, his jaw structure matches the skeleton of Richard III, which is why they used him to help create that voice. But he's also, he's interested in that part of history. He's a professional actor. And he's been working for several years on a screenplay of my first novel, Loyalty, which is a story of Richard III's life. And we have been creating a kind of a short film, which is probably going to be 15 minutes or something like that, as a sort of proof of concept, because what we want to do to tell this story, we've used reenactors to recreate the Battle of Barnet, and we want to prove that you can go for historical authenticity and make everything look really good and still have a great story going on too, and that you can combine those things. You don't have to sacrifice either one of those things. So we're creating this short film as kind of proof of concept. It's getting a red carpet premiere at Warwick Castle in March next year in 2026, which is ridiculously exciting. That's and then we've got the really big job of trying to source some kind of funding to make a full-length feature film of it.
How exciting. That is really exciting that you get to be involved in something like that. What else you got going on? I mean, I'm assuming by now everybody knows that you also have a podcast.
I hope so. So Gone Medieval is all medieval history. I also do Echoes of History now, which is a podcast that we do in association with Ubisoft. It's connected to the Assassin's Creed video game franchise. So we look at the real history and the real people behind the stories of the Assassin's Creed games, and that's great fun. And yeah, other than that, I occasional documentary appearances and things like that. I'll talk to anyone anywhere about Richard III, really. So
yeah, you've been staying busy, keeping us all entertained. I can't thank you enough. Thank you for coming on the show today to go over Richard III's myths and misconceptions, and I can't wait to have you back on again.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure. I'll come back anytime.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/TudorsDynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. You can also join the conversation with me on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time, thanks for keeping history alive.